Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm so happy to welcome back returning guests. It's been at least, we said, probably 3-4 years since I talked to Dave Warnock. So welcome back, Dave, to Mindshift Podcast.
Hey, Clint. Good to be back, man.
Man, I'm so glad that we connected on so many levels. Just for one thing, to see how the hell you're doing. Because obviously, I mean, this is not a spoiler alert. People know you have ALS. You made that very clear. And obviously, you talk about that in the book, which I'm sure we'll get to. But can you tell us how you're doing nowadays? How's the prognosis?
Well, the prognosis, I don't recall when we first recorded the podcast whether or not I had learned, as the first year of my ALS, I was seeing doctors, and I learned within the first 6 months that I have what they call a very slow progressing form of it. And initially the symptoms, the muscle degeneration was really only occurring in my hands and arms. It started in my fingers and worked its way through my hand, and then my arms became more and more useless, if you will. And that really was where it was contained for the better part of 3 years. And here in 2022, this is September of 2022, I could say that probably the beginning of this year, I don't recall exactly. It's hard to measure this kind of stuff because it's so gradual.
Mm-hmm.
You can't notice from one day to the next, but you can from one quarter to the next, or every couple of months you go, wow, this is harder to do than it was 3 months ago or whatever. But this year I've started to notice walking is becoming more challenging. It's progressed to my legs, having trouble climbing stairs, and recently got a wheelchair. I'm not confined to the wheelchair, but if we're doing something that requires a lot of walking, if I'm going to be traveling, like tomorrow, we're catching a plane. And so I'll take the wheelchair to the airport, because going from one gate to the next, and I've learned at airports with wheelchairs, you get to the front of the line. So
that's right. Jump the queue, as they say.
If you want to skip the lines, just get ALS. It's a quick way to get where you're going faster.
Yeah,
including dying.
Yeah.
But no, it's progressed to the legs, where that's everything with walking is becoming more difficult. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, up to date, September 26, 2022.
Mm-hmm.
It still hasn't progressed to my voice. I'm still speaking well and able to do things like this. So all I can do is thank God. It's obviously a God thing that he's kept that part, so I can continue to blaspheme his name over the airwaves another year or two.
And I know we'll get into this later on, because obviously you talk about it in the book, Childish Things, which is kind of why we're talking now about your book. And, we'll get into all that. You talk about when you first were diagnosed with ALS, and the fact that at that point you already had left the church and you were basically an atheist. And so that's got to be a weird thing in the sense that you're not doing it with God, so to speak. We talked about, back in the old evangelical days, you would have been on a prayer chain, and people would have been praying for you 24/7 and, asking God to heal you and all that. So you're going it alone, really, in a way, aren't you?
Yeah. And it actually makes it, strangely enough, it makes it easier. Because if you remember back in the day when God was involved in everything, whenever you got a diagnosis or whenever something happened, you had to factor God into it. Where's God in this?
Mm-hmm.
What's God doing? What's God saying? And so you pray and you ask for God's wisdom, and you ask for God to speak to you, show you why you have this disease. Is he trying to teach me something?
Right.
Is this an attack from the enemy? Is there some secret sin that I'm not aware of? And you start going through all those gyrations to try to figure out where God is. Whereas with God not in the picture anymore, when you get something like this, you just go, wow, it just happened,
Right. Shit happens.
Exactly. A certain number of people get diagnosed with this every year, and I just happen to be one of them. There's no God involved, and there's no figuring out why. You don't have to worry about the big why question. Why did I get this? My response is, why would I not get it? Why would I not be someone who got diagnosed? It just happened to me. So here we are. Now, what do we do with it?
You just deal with it. And I was going to say, okay, I said you're going it alone, but that's not really true, is it? Because one thing that really struck me from the book, and I know I keep saying we'll get to this, but when you were diagnosed with ALS, you already had a community around you of sort of ex-evangelicals, atheists. It seems like you were leaning on that community more and more and more, which basically took the place of your former church community who, let's be honest, they shit on you on a lot of levels, which unfortunately Christians are very prone to do.
Yeah.
So that's true. You have a replacement community, as it were. That's your new church in a weird way. It must be, surely, on some level.
Yeah, it is. It's very much like a church. It's a group of people who come together around a common theme. And our common theme is we've all deconstructed from a former evangelical faith. And so it's kind of trauma bonding, where you all have this identity that's connected through this shared experience. And it is very much like a church. It's like a secular church. And when we would get together, we wouldn't sing hymns and have altar calls and pass the bucket, but we would very much gather around and have community and enjoy each other's company and share stories and share life experiences and what's going on in your life and what's going on in my life. And that's really what that's what the better part of church was, if we're honest, and when I talk to people, and you do too, who've left church, what's the thing they miss the most? They miss the community. They miss that connection. And oftentimes people have a hard time finding it. We've met, Bevan and I, in our travels and in my online work, have met dozens, if not hundreds of people who live in these small towns in the country or in the world, and they're very much isolated from anyone who's like-minded. And it's very hard for them to find community. And a lot of times their community is the online community. We have this Monday night show we're doing tonight, the GD show. We do it every Monday night. And what we've seen, and you've seen it with other shows, the Atheist Experience and stuff that I've been on, you see in the chat rooms, these people gathering together. And you'll see them come into the chat room on the show, and it's like they're coming to church. They're coming to be with their people every Monday night, and you see them, hey, man, where you been? You been? Good to see you. They're just in a chat room, so it's not a real human connection, in my opinion, but it's better than nothing, and it's a way for people to connect. And so
absolutely. Yeah, especially if you live in different parts of the country or the world. Yeah, people can drop in from Australia and South Africa,
and they do.
Europe and UK and North America, and
it's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? In that way, the technology has allowed us since COVID. Really, people have been able to see that you can work from home, you can do everything on Zoom. We're talking on Zoom, you and I, right now. Yeah, I'm in the UK. Are you still kind of in the Memphis area? Where are you living?
No, I was in Nashville. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina now.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and Bevan lived here, so it made sense for us to locate here.
So are you still, that last question, I know I want to get into the book, but when we talked before, 3 years ago, you were doing the Dying Out Loud tour thing. Are you still involved in that? Is that kind of what your YouTube show has morphed into?
The YouTube show I'm still doing Dying Out Loud. That's the overall organization that formed after the diagnosis. And so that encompasses everything. I mean, like when we wrote the book, we self-published it under the Dying Out Loud label. And the GD show is a part of our Dying Out Loud YouTube channel. Those things are just stuff that we started doing in order to find more avenues to spread the word,
spread the gospel.
But yeah, speaking, I was doing a lot of speaking before COVID, and then for most of 2020 and half of 21, didn't do much of that at all. And then it started back up this year. I did a lot of conferences and have some individual speaking gigs. As we mentioned off air, my physical limitations are increasing. And so travel becomes more problematic, and I have to pick and choose where I'm going to go and be very selective about the speaking engagements that I do take. And I try to limit it mostly to conferences or places. If it's an individual group, if they can fly me in and take care of those expenses, then I'm happy to do that. But if they can't, then it's too much for us to take on to do a road tour. We used to kind of do the road tour thing and, go from stop to stop. And
on a road trip.
It's just too physically demanding for us now. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very selective. But all that's together, the Dying Out Loud thing. The GD show was just a show that we started doing a little over a year ago. And we have guests and take calls and just have conversations around important topics and things that are going on in the world that kind of affect us all. And we look at it through a secular lens. So it's been a good success, and it's been a really good way to connect with more people. That's my goal, is just to connect with as many people.
That's the goal. And as we've said many times, I just talked to Bruce Geringster. I don't know if you are familiar with him, but yeah, Bruce, he said he knew you, but we had a chat the other week, and we still have this sort of quote unquote pastoral, bent. I think so many of us he was a pastor for decades. I was a pastor for about 12 years. You were a pastor. Even though we've taken God out of that picture, we still have that heart for people, those sort of values that are sort of inbred, don't we? So you can't really seem to escape that on some levels.
It is who we are. And I told Bevan yesterday, she was gone most of the day visiting with her father and doing some stuff. And she came back and I was watching football, but I said, I spent half the day on the phone doing pastoral ministry. Yeah. I just had several phone calls from people who were going through stuff that wanted to talk. Yeah. And it's just the same thing I used to do. And
exactly. Just without the God component. Yeah, it's true.
I never got a chance to meet Bruce, but I've connected with him and we've chatted back and forth a few times, and I really would like to meet him one of these days.
Yeah, he's got a fantastic beard. So I said, you've got the better beard than mine. So you got this massive ZZ Top beard thing going on. But yeah, he's great. We had a really fantastic conversation. He's coming out of the independent fundamental Baptists. And my God, I mean, we got into the weeds on that one, but
oh God, I can't imagine.
So now going into the book, you've got this book, Childish Things, which I would say, now we got a couple of things we have to mention right up front. First of all, I went through the book on Audible, which in retrospect, I would say to people, if you could get the Audible version, do that rather than the paperback, because I would say you narrate it. And to me, that makes it even more personal. So, and I appreciate the fact that it must have been difficult physically to go through all that manuscripting and actually narrate the book, but I think it makes it a lot more poignant in that respect. I mean, is that your reasoning for why you wanted to narrate the book?
Yeah, I felt like a memoir should be read in the author's voice to be really authentic. I didn't want some other voice to tell my story. And no one loves the sound of their own voice, and I feel like I've got this southern drawl thing going on. But I think it does make it more authentic to hear the story in my voice. And yeah, it was a process. It was funny. It was during the winter, and what really it helped me in several ways. I really was a stickler for detail on the book, and I wanted to make sure there was no typos, no problem, nothing. I mean, I had it gone through with a fine-tooth comb. And what was great was when I was reading the Audible version of it, I even caught one or two more little things as minute as a space where there shouldn't be a space. And I would see it and I would fix it.
Gotta fix it.
But it was funny because I was doing it right here where I do my show, kind of a studio that I have here where I do any shows that are online. I've got a little studio quality mic and some lighting and stuff. Mm-hmm. But during the winter, I'd have to turn off the heat because the mic would pick up any little sound.
Right.
And if a truck was driving by, so somehow, for some reason, the neighbors down 2 houses down decided to do a major reconstruction on their job, right, on their house.
So big remodel job.
Their jackhammers and shit. And you could hear a plane fly over, and I had to pause every time that would happen. And so it was and my voice would get tired. So when I would talk about, I would read about 15 minutes worth, and then I would have to take a break for a couple of hours and then come back to it. So I did it in 3 or 4 segments a day. But I was not going to do an audiobook. And then Bevan talked me into it. I was really glad I did, because it's been the most popular version of the book in terms of paperback or Audible or ebook, or hardcover. I've got 4 versions: the hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audio. And the audiobook has been the most popular one. So I'm really glad I did it.
I'm really glad you did too. Now, the other thing I was going to mention, I don't see how, and I was sitting there thinking about this the last couple of days, knowing this was coming up. I don't see how we can avoid spoiler alerts for those who haven't read the book, because when we get into the topics, I mean, some of the things they know, people know you have ALS, so that comes at the end of the book, so we can just dispense with that right away, and people know that you used to be a pastor and you left the church, so that's not really a spoiler either. But there's some things that happen in the book. I don't see how we can avoid talking about them, which is going to spoil the book for someone who hasn't read it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get the book and read it or go through the Audible version. So how are we going to get there without spoiling, a lot of these things?
I don't think that's a problem. I've had people tell me, I've had a lot of really good response from the book. There's great reviews on Amazon, but I've also gotten a lot of personal messages from people who have told me how much the book impacted them. But a lot of some of the comments that I found interesting were people who would say things like, I thought I knew your story. I've heard you on so many shows, and I knew pretty much everything about your life. But then reading the book added so much detail and nuance to it that I really hadn't considered. So even if it looks like we're giving a spoiler alert with some event or experience from the book, there's still a lot in there that the reader will gain, even knowing what's coming, because there's the way that I told the story was filled with a lot of sensory detail, was what my co-writer calls it.
I agree.
She's a professor of creative writing and English and a doctorate level, so she really knows her shit. So she would say, create sensory details so people feel like they're in the room with you and they're hearing what you're hearing and seeing what you're seeing and smelling what you're smelling. And so even though an event has happened, you'll experience it differently when you read the book. And I had so many people tell me, it was like I was there, I was feeling it, I was experiencing that emotion with you. And so, I don't think we need to worry about spoiler alerts.
Okay, we'll just dispense with that. Well, and one thing I love about the book, just as a comment too on that issue, yes, it is. It's got that sensory appeal to it. You feel like you're right there with you as these things are happening. But as you're talking about the time you were an evangelical and then a pastor, a church leader and all that, you don't necessarily reflect on it in the text critically at that point. You say, God led me to do this, or I prayed and the Spirit led, and you that was the language that you used at the time. That's how we talked.
Right.
And I noticed there's only a couple of points in the actual narrative where you the narrator, as it were, comments on the character Dave.
Right.
Does that make sense? Where you say that happened and I no longer believe that, or something, you just kind of let it flow. And what struck me was, it is that uncritical thing where you're allowing the reader to experience that along with you. Because like I said, that's how we talked, that's how we thought, that's how we lived when we were in the church.
Yeah, I'm glad that came through to you, because I really, really, really wanted to make sure. And that was what was hard about writing the book, was putting myself back into that scene and living it, reliving it. 20, 30 years ago, these things happened. And when I put myself back in the play, I wanted to be the Dave that was there in 1977 or 1976 or 1989. I didn't want to be looking back on that Dave from the vantage point of today's Dave.
Right.
And so it kind of forced me to relive it as I'm telling the story, and it made me relive the emotions, and for good or bad,
Sure.
Because a lot of those were bad memories, or they're bad memories now, but in the time it was who I was.
Exactly.
It was the person I was living in that moment. And so I really tried to capture the moment and not reflect back on it from today's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now you have a different sort of what they call the epic situation, which is your point of view as Dave, as the person you are now. As you say, looking back, you could so easily intrude into the narrative and make those narratorial comments and say something about it. But I appreciate the fact that you don't, because like I said, it took me right back when you talk about becoming a Christian in the first place, because the structure of the book, another thing that I was struck by was that it's got sort of two sides to it. On the one hand, you dip in and out of your experiences with your father, and divorcing your mother, and then every so often you just stick a little chapter in there where you have an encounter with your dad, and then maybe several years later another little encounter, and as the book goes on, and then you've got your personal story sort of interspersed in between those. And what struck me is that a couple of things. One is that obviously it was a very bittersweet thing, because as he goes along, this is a spoiler alert, he gets more and more entrenched in his fundamentalism and just absolutely dogmatic, and how that kind of destroyed your relationship. And then one thing that struck me was that when I was a pastor, I used to tell people, don't let your relationship with your earthly father distort the view of God. That must have come through at some point. Like, your view of God was warped somehow by your father, who was a fundamentalist, and he, abandoned you and went off and lived his different life. I mean, were you thinking along those lines at any point?
Yeah, that was the struggle. The Massey vignettes, if you will. His name was Massey, so we called those the Massey verses. And the struggle throughout my life was this sense of disconnect between how my heavenly father was supposed to treat me and care for me, and how my earthly father was completely disconnected from that and dissociated with that. Although he claimed a faith in God, he was very much an adamant that his Christianity was the true and right one, the only right one in mine. That was the struggle. I was a charismatic, evangelical, spirit-filled, tongue-talking Christian all of those years. And when he would intrude himself or reintrude back into my life, he literally popped in and out just like it shows in the book.
You'll just appear one day.
Yeah, you're reading along in the book, and then here comes a Massey verse out of nowhere that is not connected with the ongoing narrative of my story. But that's how he was in my life. He literally showed up in our driveway one day. I mean, that really happened. And he would send these letters. And so in all of that, in all of his interaction with me, he would tell me how wrong my faith was. I wasn't doing it right. And so there was this struggle with me trying to appease my earthly father, but disagree with him and feel his disapproval. And it continued to mess with me well into my 50s, until my therapist said, don't even open the letters. Just quit reading those letters from him. Those are not doing you any good.
Too toxic.
They're toxic. Yeah.
Yeah. I had to do the same thing with my mother. I have, someone said she would send me the keyboard warrior emails, the long ranting emails.
Yeah.
And someone said, just create a folder in your inbox. It's labeled mom. And when you see an email from her, just shove it in there. Don't even read it. Just, so I've got loads of emails that my mother wrote to me, and she's kind of stopped doing that now. But, same kind of thing. She's concerned that I'm going to hell, and, all the rest of it. Yeah, it's true. Well, now when you talk about becoming a Christian, I mean, like I say, there's so many points at which I resonated, in the book, because when you were a young kid, you become a Christian, and a lot of that's in that context of, you're rootless, you're kind of living on your own with your brother, your mom, I think you got divorced, she moves off to Washington, D.C. So you're back and forth. You've got this very strange kind of life. Out of that comes, you find Jesus, and it was a wonderful, amazing thing. I mean, your life did change on a lot of levels, didn't it? I mean, that's what comes across in the book.
Yeah, that era, for people that don't know how intoxicating the Jesus movement was, it's an era that most people that you would meet today wouldn't realize, wouldn't know, because it was literally in the early mid 70s, when it was on the cover of Time magazine, and popular records were, Jesus is just all right with me, the Doobie Brothers.
Oh yeah.
Jesus Christ Superstar was a big hit. Godspell.
And the music, Christian rock came out of that.
The Christian rock, Larry Norman, all that stuff. So for an 18-year-old boy, fresh out of high school with really not solid direction and not solid guidance, and wondering what's next in my life and what am I going to do with myself, and for Jesus to come along and give you something to attach yourself to, some bigger story that you can become a part of. That was the intoxicating draw and to get involved with a group of people where, the one chapter where I got saved, the energy in the room was nothing like I'd ever seen before. And it was just like, wow, I can jump into this.
Yeah, there's something here.
And be somebody and do something important. And Jesus is coming back, and the world, is happening. Everything's happening. And I can jump in the middle of that and be and for a guy that didn't have much going on, that was pretty appealing.
Yeah. And I can remember too, because I grew up, I'm maybe a couple years younger than you, but I grew up in church. Okay. So I was about 10, 11 years old in the mid 70s. So right in that era you're talking about. And I remember one of the things, it made Jesus cool, because you had guys that had long hair, and beards, cool. And all that stuff. And that, my parents, they were squares, man. I mean, my dad had short hair. He would never have grown a beard in a million years. Nobody in our church had one. And we had a couple guys come in, and they had leather jackets and long hair and played, guitars, electric guitars, and had drum sets, That's what inspired me to become a drummer, because I got into Christian rock. I used to listen to Larry Norman, Resurrection Band, Petra, then Stryper, all those early bands that sort of broke the scene wide open. And I thought, okay, this is something I can be a part of. I could grow my hair. I can play rock. I can play heavy metal for God, though. So I was like, when you're talking about opening that coffee shop and that scene, bringing Russ Taff and his band in, I'm like, yes, I saw Russ Taff live. I knew exactly who you were talking about.
Yeah, I bet you were.
Oh man, took me right back. With you, man. Yeah, because we played in secular taverns and pubs all over Seattle when I was in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's what it was. It was rocking for God. We were going to go out in the world, man, and be cool and have long hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you could do that,
I love you use the word square, because that was, we thought of church people as square, they
were so square, man.
We didn't go to the churches, man. They were dead. We were taking Jesus to the streets, dude.
Exactly. But yeah, there's another poignant moment where you talk about, and it just took me right back. So you're talking about, at one point you're working in construction, you're a young guy, you're an on fire evangelical in this Jesus movement. At one point you go off to a construction job in another state, I think it was. And I remember you talking about, here's the guys that you're working on the job site with. Then at night, you're going back to the hotel. They're cracking open a couple of beers. Nothing's out of control, but you are in this struggle. And I can remember so poignantly being in those situations where you had to be a witness for God. You couldn't have that beer. You couldn't laugh at their dirty jokes. You were supposed to be above all that. And there's that struggle all the time. How do you be a friend to these guys and yet evangelize to them when they see you at your best and your worst? And man, that just hit me like a ton of bricks when you went through that section.
Yeah, I really was able to recreate those. Man, it was fun. It was hard but fun to revisit those experiences and to relive those feelings of confusion. Because I remember feeling confused and these are things I hadn't thought about in decades until I was writing that particular chapter, for instance. And so when I'm writing that particular chapter, and this is something that happened in probably 1975. So we're reaching way back, man.
Yeah, right back.
and so, but as I'm, and it's what was interesting, as I'm writing, literally as I'm writing on a daily basis, I start remembering things and feelings that I hadn't thought about in decades.
Yeah, you forgot all that.
I remembered feeling confused. How am I going to witness to these people if I'm trying to avoid them so as to not be sucked into their sinful behavior? So on the one hand, I don't want to be tempted to look at their Playboy magazines with them, but
have that Budweiser.
If I don't get around them, how am I going to witness to them?
Exactly. I can remember that so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got saved when I was in the Navy. So I'd already been in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And I'd been drinking and doing all the rest of it. Then I got saved and I just like overnight gave all that stuff up. So here's all my Navy buddies. I'd still go to the club with them after work, but they would be drinking beer and I'd be drinking Coke. So suddenly everything's changed. I'm trying to be this good Christian boy.
Yeah, they start calling you preacher boy, and
and you're stuck. Yet you've got to witness to
really. But then you can also turn that on its head and go, well, they persecuted Jesus, so they're going to persecute me, and then you can become the martyr for God.
Martyr.
There's so many different places you can tuck all that.
We are going to return in just a few minutes in the second half of this chat with my good friend Dave Warnock. I'm really glad to have reconnected with him. It's a very poignant kind of thing. Of course, as we mentioned, knowing that he's got ALS and he's not getting any better, I'm really glad to have him on the show for sure. And it's been too many years since we touched base. But when we come back, we're going to go ahead and pick up this story of what happened when he was on that trip with his construction buddies. And there's another part to that story. We're also going to talk about his time in ministry and the effects that it had on him on a lot of levels. And then, of course, him becoming an atheist, and then his activism work with his dying out loud stuff on the back end of the episode. So there's a lot more still to come in the second half of this chat. What I wanted to do, though, is let you know what's coming up here in the next few weeks, next few episodes here on Mindshift Podcast. We've got another ex-minister, and I mentioned him in this episode, Bruce Goeringser, and we talked a little bit ago. He's another ex-pastor like me and like Dave. He comes out of the IFB, which is the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, and that's a whole nother story there. So we had a really good time talking, me and Bruce, the other week, so that's coming up next. And then I'm going to start embarking on this stuff. I've been mentioning it for a while. I've done a lot of research on Pastor Doug Wilson. He's running a sort of a sprawling, some would say a cult-like empire up out of Moscow, Idaho, up in the northwest of the United States. And I've already had a conversation. I talked to returning guest David Johnson. We had a chat the other week, and we talked about a Christian defense of slavery. And Doug Wilson plays a part in this because he wrote a book, I think it was in 1996. He co-wrote a book with someone called Stephen Wilkins, who was the co-founder of the League of the South, which is itself a racist organization. They wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was, and that kind of forms the basis of the conversation that I had with David Johnson, and he's really an expert in this field. In fact, speaking of David, he's going to be our guest in October for our Mindshift Zoom call. We had Luna Corbden on just in the month of September, and now going forward into October, David's going to be coming back. I think it's on the 23rd of October, so I'm really looking forward to having David come back in on the show. And of course, as always, if you want to be a part of those Mindshift Zoom calls, you can support the show on Patreon. If you appreciate the work that I'm doing, you can check out the links that are in the show notes to my Patreon page. And then the other thing I was going to mention too is that, okay, I talked about Doug Wilson. Well, I've been doing a ton of research. I've been getting a lot of help from the Examining Doug Wilson, some of the group that hosts their Facebook page and their Twitter site. We've talked a few times, and I've got a couple of episodes coming out on Doug Wilson. The first one, we're going to look at the many scandals that have surrounded Doug Wilson, and more tellingly perhaps is how he's handled those scandals and what it says about his character and whether or not he's actually leading a cult empire. We're going to analyze that in the first episode, and then in the second half we're going to do part two because there's a lot of research that I've done. I think it'd be too much to do one episode. I'm going to get into the issue of all the people in Doug Wilson's orbit. So what kind of people does he surround himself with? Who are the people that he influences, I should say. And there's some really, really disturbing stuff going on. There's a lot of pastors, young guys who are kind of part of this, what's called the manosphere. And these guys are pushing his patriarchy message, and it's become very, very toxic. So that's another aspect of the Doug Wilson story. So we're going to take a deep dive into Doug Wilson, at least 2 episodes. And then we've got the one, as I say, with David Johnson, talking about a Christian defense of slavery. So there's a lot coming up on Doug Wilson. So look for those episodes coming out. And I will just say, before we get back into the second half of this chat with Dave Warnock, you can follow me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can also look me up on my public Facebook page, Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. And finally, you can also subscribe to the Mindshift Podcast YouTube channel. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with my good friend Dave Warnock as we continue to listen to his story as he lays it out in his book, Childish Things. Another thing that hit me, you talk about on this construction job, you find this church kind of like across the highway or the street from the hotel, and you strike up a friendship with the pastor and his family. They kind of take you in, and you're living away from home. And I remember doing the exact same thing. I was in Fallon, Nevada on the Navy base there, and I did the same thing. I didn't want to mix with the guys from the base because they were all going out getting drunk and going to Nevada, prostitution's legal. So they all wanted to do that. So I found a little church in town, made friends with the pastor, used to go to the Wednesday night Bible studies. So I'm thinking, yes, I can so resonate with that story. But yeah, you kind of became mentored a little bit by this guy. You sort of helped him out in ministry as well.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see, how, again, once you're always trying to find out what's God saying, what's God doing. And so when I found the little church there, little Assembly of God church there in Utah, and it was literally right across the highway from the hotel we were staying in, I immediately changed the narrative from God was bringing me on this trip to witness to these construction workers,
right,
to God was bringing me on this trip to minister to this little church and to bring some life to them. Because I came in as the hippie Jesus freak in bell bottoms to this quiet little dead church full of old gray white hairs. Mm-hmm. And the pastor latched onto me like I was a drug, oh, come right. Come here. We need your energy.
Need some life in this place.
I'm dying here, and so
throw me a bone, something.
I remember feeling really bad for him when I left. I remember feeling like I'm abandoning this. Here I am, a baby Christian. And I'm talking, this was probably 1974. And I'd been a Christian maybe 6 months at this point. So I'm a little infant in spiritual terms. And I remember thinking, how could it be that I feel bad that I'm abandoning this guy who's been serving God for years? But it felt that way. I felt like me leaving was taking something away from him that he needed. And I remember feeling really bad about that. I kept up with several of his kids for several years.
Oh, right.
And they all had trouble. In fact, one of them is still a Facebook friend, a girl there. One of the girls, her life has been a mess. One of the boys that I met ended up committing suicide after also killing his ex-wife in a murder-suicide thing. You hear story after story like that, and you realize God never changed anyone's life. God never helped anyone. Mm-hmm. Anyone that had a good life made it themselves. And there was no Holy Spirit anywhere doing anything for anyone.
Yeah. And that's, I think, another theme that comes across really clearly in the book is that, you serve God. So you come back from this trip, you open a coffee house, you then end up becoming a pastor of a couple different churches. Yeah. And yet you were always struggling financially. Always. Terrible things happened. Your house burned down. And where was God and all that? And well, it was a wonderful thing because you got a new house built and it was even better. See, God came through. In the end, it was a terrible thing, teaching you a lesson about faith. But you're always struggling. But those of us that serve God the most, the pastors, the church leaders, we had the hardest time of it. So where's that? Where's God when it comes down to all that? You could even say, well, God's, you're keeping you poor so that you'll continue to trust and rely on him and lead a life of faith. So it never does work, does it, on that level?
No, there's so many disconnected pieces that you have to make up the story as you go along. And that's why the confusion when you have to factor God into whatever happens in your life. And as you said earlier, God never gets the blame. He just gets the credit. So
he always gets off the
bad,
hook.
It's on us. We're doing something wrong. If something's going good, then God's blessing you.
Yeah. So I'm reading that chapter, going through it when you talk about your house. Yeah, it was like a chimney fire or something like that. And you're standing on the street. You grabbed all the valuables out of the house. It was like around Christmas, I think it was. I mean, horrible time. And even then, watching the house go up in flames, you're thinking, where's God in all this? Yeah. And everything we thought. I mean, I remember Dr. Marlene Winnell, she said, the thing about religion, it's all pervasive. It pervades every single area and aspect of our lives. We can't avoid somehow interpreting everything around every suffering that comes our way is somehow God doing something. And we may not even find out the answer this side of heaven. I mean, I can remember saying that as a pastor. I'm sure you probably said it. Yeah. You'll know maybe when you get there. And then you go into pastoring. And I can remember you talk about in the book, the politics, getting caught up in the church politics. I mean, again, that took me right back. Again, where's God in all that? You got screwed out of a couple different pastoral jobs. Where's God? What's he trying to teach you in all this?
Yeah, that's another thing I've gotten several comments from people about is getting a glimpse into the back room, if you will, the behind the scenes of the goings on in church, because people just see the Sunday morning show.
Yeah.
The show that is put on every Sunday morning or Wednesday night or Sunday night. They don't see the politics and the personality conflicts and the power struggles and the backbiting and the gossip and the shit that goes on. It's a business. Church is a business, and it takes dollars and cents to run it. It takes money. There's power struggles. There's personality. There's conflicts and all that stuff. And the more you get into that and see behind the scenes, the less of the Spirit of God you begin to experience. And I remember longing for the simple days of just having a coffee house and just simply
rocking for God.
Yeah. And then you get jaded and you get bitter and you get angry and you start operating as a business in the church, and it loses all of its simplicity and beauty and love, if you will.
Well, and I read an article the other day. It was actually on Fox News of all places, and it was a poll that's just come out. I don't know if you saw that. Something like 42% of American pastors are thinking about leaving the ministry. And one of the pastors they interviewed said, you get something, it's like decision anxiety or decision fatigue, something like that, where he said, no matter what decision you make as a leader, there's going to be a faction within the church that's going to disagree with it, that's going to be against it. And there's another faction that supports it. And some of the leaders will be against it, some will support it. And I can remember that thinking, when I was a pastor, it was exactly the same thing. There was always a vocal minority. There was always a few rabble rousers. Some people on the elder board were a problem, so it was just constant, as you say. It was draining, physically exhausting, emotionally, spiritually exhausting. One of the most thankless jobs, really, that you can have. Yeah. It really is. And then, though, you've got this relationship with Phoebe, your now ex, and I know that's another spoiler alert, but it struck me again that as you started going through the deconstruction process, she begins kind of doubling down. I mean, how did that go in the end, where you start really investigating? Because one thing you said that struck me, said you kind of realized, wait a minute, I've been teaching, I've been preaching, I've been leading Bible studies for decades. I've actually never really taken a deep dive into what I believe. And you go on this journey and you're like, holy shit, man, there's some real problems here. But yet at the same time, she's doubling down, which obviously led to conflicts.
Yeah, it was a difficult time, to be sure, because she knew me to be an authentic person, and she saw firsthand the journey that I was on and knew that I wasn't just making stuff up, that I was genuinely troubled by what I was seeing and thinking about the faith my lifelong faith, and it had been hers as well. But she wasn't interested in joining me in that study, in that discovery.
That journey,
She was more really just, I kind of summed it up. I don't think I said it this way in the book, but I just realized that she really just was wanting to keep believing because it was a comfort level to her. Mm-hmm. It was like a warm blanket that she didn't want to let go of. And I was more interested in finding out what the truth was, and whatever it cost me. And it ended up costing me a lot. But I just wasn't the kind of person that could close my eyes to something that I'd seen. Yeah. And for whatever reason, many people can. They just say, oh, I don't, that room, the stuff in that room is really ugly. I'm just going to close the door here and not look in that room anymore. Yeah. I'm not able to do that. I'm going to get in the room and figure out what's in there.
Right. You have to be true to yourself, and you're on that journey. Well, and the other aspect that comes out, this probably the most painful part of the book, I think, for me, was hearing about how, okay, so you've got a couple of daughters and their spouses, they're involved in ministry at the same church that you were a part of, because I think you were pastoring like a satellite church, weren't you? Right. And you were told, or the pastor told your sons-in-law and daughters to basically shun you when over some ridiculous stuff. You tried and tried and tried. Oh, yeah. To ask for forgiveness and, begging and pleading and weeping. And they were basically, no, we're going to shun you. We're told by the leadership. I mean, talk about your family turns against you. Talk about how painful that could be.
Yeah, that was a part of the book that was probably of all the, I took some creative license throughout the book, as you can with a memoir, but of any part of the book that was more true to life and almost word for word, some of the conversations and meetings it was that part.
Yeah.
I mean, I really went to painstaking effort to tell that part of it as true to what happened as I could. And it was tough. It was a very, very tough time, and painful, and really excruciating for my ex and myself, and went on for several years.
Right. So are you reconciled to your daughters now, would you say?
One of them has recently, in the last couple of years, opened back up to me and started dialoguing. I've seen her and the grandkids a few times. The other one still isn't, primarily because, from what I've learned, they're still connected with that pastor and his wife in a very real way. So they still have the poison IV hooked up to themselves.
Yeah.
But struggle is what led me to start questioning everything, because I was at such a place of desperation for help from church leaders in the denomination, church leaders in the neighborhood, in the city, and then God. God, help me here. This is my family that's blowing apart, and it's only because I was trying to serve you. So can you offer a little, throw me a bone here?
Right, something. Anything.
I started thinking, wait just a minute, is he even there?
Yeah.
And that's really what got me. Some people say, oh, you just fell away because you're mad at God. No. Or because the church mistreated. A lot of people say,
yeah, you're burned. You got burned.
Yeah, you just got burned by the church. You just need to find a better church. It's not religion, it's relationship. It's all that.
I've heard it, man.
No, it didn't. It led me. It was a catalyst to cause me to begin to search out my faith. But once I started searching, I realized there's a lot that's not adding up here, and I've never taken the time to investigate it in 3.5 decades. Embarrassingly, that was the case.
Yeah, but at least you did, though. At least you did. And of course, in the end, another spoiler alert, it cost you your marriage. It just wasn't going to happen. She was going to stay a Christian. You were not, so that's an aspect of this whole story. I mean, in my case, I'm divorced as well, the last couple of years. However, it was slightly different in that we went on the deconstruction journey together. We served in ministry for years like you guys did, but luckily that wasn't the issue that led to us divorcing. So in that sense, I didn't walk that same journey that you did. We shared that sort of deconstruction, but when you leave your spouse, then it's a whole nother world opening up, which you describe in the book, because off the back of that, then you build this new community, and then you get diagnosed with ALS in the midst of that. So someone would say, oh, God's punishing you, Dave. That's what this is. He's trying to get your attention for walking away. I'm sure someone must have said that or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard allusions to that. People don't have the courage to say it to my face, but I've heard others allude to that to someone else. And there's a really simple response to that. There's like one of my daughters, I mentioned in the book, has dealt with cancer. And so you have to answer then, if God's punishing me with ALS for my deconversion, then she's got cancer, very serious stage 4 cancer. Is he punishing her, or is he just testing her? See,
right. What is it?
Just don't add up.
Yep. He's teaching her a lesson on faith. Because I can remember I took a class in seminary called The Theology of Suffering. And basically it's what you articulated earlier, this whole idea that we were going to go through and exhaustively study all through the Bible and come up with all the reasons why the Bible talks about why God allows suffering in our lives. We spent a week going through all this, from 8 to 5 every day in this seminary, and I felt like, okay, I walked away from that, like you said, with a bunch of answers. So people, when they asked me, there was some sort of answer. Maybe he's punishing you. Maybe it's sin that you've done. Maybe it's a lesson in faith. There's a million reasons. And the ultimate thing comes down, well, it's we don't know. We will find out when we get to heaven. The ultimate trump card.
We just don't know. God's ways are higher.
God's ways are in a mysterious way. Well, the last thing I was going to mention, one thing that really strikes me about the book too, is that surely it must answer the charge. Okay, Dave, you were never a Christian. That must be another charge that people have laid at your door, and they say, okay, yeah, you walked away from the faith, but the fact is you were never saved to begin with. So you don't have it. You never had anything to begin with. But I think the book shows that you were dedicated 100%. You were all in for decades,
Mm-hmm.
What more could you have done to prove that you were a true Christian?
Yeah, there have been people who, that's one of the standard responses to deconversion is you were never a Christian. Yeah, and my response to that is if that's true, then nobody is.
Yeah, who can say they are?
Yeah, because nobody tried harder than me. If you look at if you read my book, you'll see that, like you said, I gave it everything I had. The other response to that is, you're right. I wasn't a Christian because there is no such thing.
Right.
It's just a label that people attach to themselves to identify with a certain brand of religion, and it's not a thing. Nobody's ever changed. There's no born again. You can't be born again. I mean, these are all biblical terms, but
sure.
It's nothing that actually ever happens. No Holy Spirit comes in and regenerates your life. Yeah. So yeah, I was never a Christian, and neither are you, because there's not one.
Right. You can call yourself whatever you want, but
yeah.
Well, I know you've got to go because you got another show to do. So the book is Childish Things. Again, I would recommend people, if you can get it on Audible, buy the book regardless. But I just really think the Audible version is like streets higher than the other ones. It's so much better. And so how can people find you? What's the best way to get a hold of you if they want to follow up on this conversation, or they've read the book and they say, I'd love to talk to Dave? Well,
the easiest way is just to go. The website is daveoutloud.org. Not dying out loud, but daveoutloud.org. The book's on Amazon, and any version you want. It's on the Audible. There are people that do want signed copies. We do ship those out to the continental US and Canada, but not overseas because, well, you want to pay for the shipping. I had somebody from Hungary ask me about a book, and I said, well, figure out the shipping and I'll send it to you.
That's right. I don't mind signing it, but I'm not paying to go to Hungary.
But yeah, I do have a lot of people requesting signed copies, and they can get the email from the website, and we're happy to do that if it works out, for shipping and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's I think I'm really pleased with how the book came out. I really, everybody has a story, and when you tell people, yeah, I'm writing a memoir, sometimes you see the glossy look in their eyes and they go,
here we go.
Yeah. Okay. Now you're going to want me to read your memoir, and now I'm going to have to tell you, yeah, it's good. But
when you don't really think it is.
The response has been really overwhelming to me, and I've really been pleased with how it came out. And so I think people will enjoy the story. It's a story worth telling, and I think we told it well.
I think you really did. And I posted it up in our Facebook group, and I said, if you grew up in evangelicalism in the sort of 70s, 80s, early 90s, that period, then even more so you'd want to read the book, because like I say, I grew up in a lot of that era, and so many things just resonated point by point by point. So it's definitely a good memoir on that level for sure. So thank you so much, Dave. I know you've got to go because you've got another show to do, but thank you again for taking the time out. I know we had a hell of a time getting this together.
Yeah.
We must have rescheduled about 10 times, but we finally made it happen. So thank you so much, Dave.
My pleasure.